right away. Brethren, I'd like to introduce to you Robin Adams, Associate, what's your title?
Collections Management.
Collections at Mount Vernon, and Laura Simo, Associate Curator at Mount Vernon. Please help us in welcoming them to Mount Nebo Lodge.
To share this auspicious occasion with you today, and the very, very warm welcome that we've received on this fine morning, and it's still sun shining outside, just a glorious, glorious day. On behalf of the Regent and Vice Regents of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, we congratulate Mount Nebo Lodge on your 200th anniversary. There are few societies and institutions that can claim such a long and distinguished lineage. The Ladies Association is about 40 years your junior, in fact. And the fact that Mount Nebo Lodge exists is a testament to the enduring principles of Freemasonry that George Washington lived by, and proof that brotherhood and community still are being lived and exist in a world, I think, where individualism and materialism threaten the foundations on which our great nation was founded. Let me also say that it's been a real honor for me personally, as well as other members of our collection staff and Mount Vernon as a whole, to have gotten to know so many of the brethren here at Mount Nebo, especially a current master, George Baldwin, and past masters Ed Calhoun and Ed Burwell. We thank you. You've just been absolutely wonderful to work with. Just perfect gentlemen. So some of you are probably thinking, what did Mount Vernon think when this object came to our attention? Well, I have to admit, we approach every Washington object with a bit of skepticism. We receive hundreds of inquiries every year from people saying that they either have items that belonged or were associated with the Washingtons or that came from Mount Vernon. Yes, just a small fraction, small percentage of these objects, then, as you can imagine, turn out to be, kind of make it to that next step of, this is a good possibility for a Washington piece. And when we first saw the image of the apron here, it was pretty clear to us that indeed this was something very, very special. We ask ourselves, we forget the fact that it might have any connection to Washington, and simply ask ourselves, are we faced with an object that can date from George Washington's time? That's really where we have to start. And with the apron, was just, everything was spot on for it with us. The materials were right. A silk-on-silk embroidery. Had this had any cotton in it, for example, we would have known immediately not right. Cotton, particularly needlework, you don't see until the early 19th century. But beautiful silk-on-silk embroidery of really good quality, probably professional level stitching that we're seeing here. Gold and silver wrapped threads, very expensive, embellished with things like gold, silver beads and bangles. And there originally are several areas in here where there even would have been pastes, glass pastes. So if you can imagine this object, again, the silk, of course, very fragile, light sensitive. This has seen, some fading of colors. But imagine, the vibrant blue, the vibrant red in the American flag, the vibrant greens of the acacia, and then these little studded areas with paste that would have caught the light and the spangles and the gold and silver threads that just would have shimmered. Absolutely stunning, stunning object. So the materials looked right, construction looked right for 18th century. Also important was the amount of wear. My experience with Washington objects has been is that they are greatly loved. And there are a few Washington objects that come to our attention in pristine condition. Generally things that do, those are the ones to be most suspicious about. And I have to say, and perhaps Brother Alwyn has talked about the many times this apron was worn in the 19th century. And so that was great because that was consistent with the amount of wear that we were seeing on the piece. So all of these things were adding up. We looked to other examples as well. Very important. Our field is one of compare and contrast. If you have something that looks like nothing else, then you really have to be suspicious of it again. But in this case, we knew, and again, I have to credit Brother Tabard, who was in contact with scholars in Europe, and who knew of French aprons, and even some Dutch aprons that had very striking similarities to this one. There's also an example, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, at the New York Historical Society, of one that was owned by Robert Livingston. And I understand that they just put that on view in November. I'm very eager to go up and have a look at it. So again, all these things are adding up. There's several others that compare and date as well. But the final test for us at Mount Vernon, when we try to authenticate Washington objects, is to determine provenance, or the history of the piece. And we, I have to say, are absolutely spoiled. Washington left behind thousands, tens of thousands of documents that are still being discovered and scoured through that every year are turning up new information on the general and his life. And in this instance, as many of you probably know by now, Washington's inventory, taken shortly after his death in 1800, lists at least 2 lots of Masonic regalia in his study. And those pieces, again, were purchased at the private sales held among the legatees after Martha Washington's death on July 22nd of 1802. And I'll just very briefly say that kind of was an interesting sale. When we read about that particular sale, it's all men who are doing the purchasing at that July 22nd sale. And it seems to be all things that belong to the general that must have been set aside. We don't know. There's some speculation that among these legatees, the nephews, the Martha Washington's grandson and other relatives, male relatives, that they might have determined who was going to purchase what. But we don't know for certain. But Captain Thomas Hammond, who had married George Washington's niece, Mildred, a daughter of his brother Charles, of course, who found in Charlestown, purchased the apron for $6. What we lack, unfortunately, is correspondence between Washington and Lafayette, or Washington and the Grand Lodge of France, acknowledging this piece. But unfortunately, I think there too, between revolutions and wars of the 18th and 19th century, and certainly, I think, the terrible destruction of so many records under the Nazi occupation might be that that sort of documentation never will be discovered. But the object, we believe, speaks for itself, and we have to come back to that all the time. The object really is the key here. I also, just very briefly, wanted to say various other Masonic aprons have come to Mount Vernon's attention over the years. I was just looking at this yesterday, and there was one, I think, going back as early as 1881, believe it or not. And I can't always tell how the association was responding to these, but I was struck by one in the early 20th century where we did write the person back, and they had encouraged the person to take the apron to a Masonic lodge or to the memorial, because Mount Vernon was only collecting material for Washington's domestic life. And I thought that's such an unusual phrase because the principles of Freemasonry that Washington lived by would have been part of his public life and his domestic life. How do you separate that? Most dramatic that I thought that they said, oh, not part of the domestic life. What does that mean? I think this is really central to Washington's, again, domestic life, his public life, who he was wherever he was in life. And I can't say enough how proud we are that we'll be able to educate again our over 1 million visitors and the almost usually around 12 to 15,000 visitors who annually come on President's Day, when we'll have this out on view, to this aspect, this very important aspect of Washington's life. Brother Alwyn asked me if I would just also briefly say a word about the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. We are the nation's oldest historic preservation organization, again founded in 1853 by a South Carolinian by the name of Anne Pamela Cunningham. And it began as a grassroots effort among the ladies of the United States to purchase George Washington's home when the state of Virginia and the federal government would not do so. Since that time, and I can't imagine when this would ever change, we have not accepted a single cent of local, state, or federal funding. We are a completely independent entity that is totally reliant on you all and your friends and your relatives and everyone that you tell to come to visit Mount Vernon. Our main source of income that allows us to promote Washington's legacy comes from ticket sales. And I'm proud to say again, this past week we just passed the 1 million visitors mark, I think for about the 4th or 5th year in a row at least. So that's really a goal of ours every year to make. Thank you again for having us here. Thank you again for sharing this most extraordinary object with us. And as I said to Brother Alwyn, I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have about the piece or about Mount Vernon in general. Do let me know.